Hello again, and welcome back to Beatle Basics. I'm your host, Craig Smith. This is part two of episode one, which I've entitled Interesting Facts You May Not Have Known About the Beatles. As a refresher, in part one of this episode, we covered the fact that the Beatles were once a five-piece band. We talked about the fact that they had several drummers prior to Ringo and even prior to Pete Best. We talked about the origin of the term the Fab Four, and we also talked about the journey that led to the name the Beatles. You will recall regarding the genesis of the name Beatles that it was credited primarily to Stuart Sutcliffe and John Lennon. And we talked about the fact that the name Beatle might have been on Stuart Sutcliffe's mind because he was a fan of the movie The Wild One. I believe in the previous episode I might have said Wild Bunch. The movie was The Wild One with Lee Marvin and Marlon Brando. In that movie, Lee Marvin's character refers to Beatles, meaning girls who hung around with motorcycle gangs. At any rate, that might have been why the term Beatles was on Stuart Sutcliffe's mind. So, as we move on then, I want to talk about the role that Yoko Ono played in the breakup of the Beatles. That age-old question, we all look at her as this wicked woman who came into John Lennon's life and led to the end of the greatest rock and roll band in history. Well, although Yoko Ono certainly was a factor in the breakup, she was by no means the only factor. Even among those who were closest to the Beatles, it was a slow process. It was very unclear exactly what caused it. There was certainly not one singular event that caused the breakup of the Beatles. For example, Neil Aspinall, who you'll recognize as one of the Beatles' inner circle, he became what the closest thing they ever had to a roadie, he and Mal Evans. Neil Aspinall made the following statement: "The split was a slow process. For a start, Paul not signing with Alan Klein. Incidentally, Alan Klein was one of the two men that they were considering to replace Brian Epstein as their manager following Brian Epstein's death. Paul not signing with Alan Klein didn't mean the Beatles had split up because they then made Abbey Road. John was working more and more with Yoko rather than with the Beatles, but he still made Abbey Road with the others. So there wasn't one moment in time. It was gradual." So what were some of the other causes then? One was sheer boredom. Boredom with the whole process, the whole idea of being a Beatle, the countless hours in the recording studio, the madness that had become touring, the drudgery, although very creative process of writing music. All these things just became tiresome for them because they had done it for so long. In his book, The Beatles, Hunter Davies says, "The Beatles started to break up as far back as 1966, when they gave up touring and stopped living communal lives." Speaking of a breakup, going back as far as 1966, it was first Ringo who walked out on the group. He left the group just for a day, but he did leave the group during the recording of the White Album. And it was then George's turn, who walked out during the Let It Be sessions. So as Mr. Davies points out, it was a slow, gradual process. Paul, on the other hand, loved everything about being a Beatle. He was the catalyst, if you will, behind some of their more progressive projects, such as Magical Mystery Tour film. He also showed more interest than the others in the Apple Corporation and how to expand it and so forth. John, on the other hand, completely bored and fed up with being a Beatle. And it was at that time that Yoko Ono entered his life. It was as if new energy, new life had been breathed into him. Whereas Paul had been his soulmate, if you will, Yoko soon took over that role. The other factor that led to their breakup was girlfriends. Paul had Linda Eastman, George had Patty Boyd, a young woman he had met during the filming of A Hard Day's Night. Ringo had met and married Maureen Cox. Although these three women were not with their respective Beatle 24/7 like Yoko was with John, they were all splitting significant time between the band and their girlfriends. The next factor that led to their breakup was the sudden death of Brian Epstein, their manager, on August 17th, 1967. The impact of Brian's tragic death cannot be overstated in terms of the Beatles and their business and their personal lives. As a matter of fact, he did everything for them. The Beatles were musicians, they were performers, they were not businessmen. He not only handled the band's finances, he handled their individual finances. He dealt with things like merchandise licensing. He instructed them on what songs they would play in their shows. George made the following comment regarding the death of Brian Epstein and its impact. After Brian died, there was a huge void. We didn't know anything about our personal business and finances. He had everything taken care of. It was chaos after that. Well, of course, with the death of Brian Epstein came the task of replacing him. They basically had two options. The first option, as I alluded to a minute ago, was a man by the name of Alan Klein. Mr. Klein was already managing certain musical acts, Bobby Vinton, Bobby Darin, later on the Rolling Stones, and he first met John Lennon and Yoko while they were making Let It Be, and John immediately recognized the benefit that Mr. Klein could bring to their band. In fact, John made the statement that if he continued to spend money at the present rate, he would be broke in 6 months. So they all knew they needed someone, and John, Ringo, and George wanted that someone to be Alan Klein. Paul, on the other hand, wanted something different. He wanted someone else. He was at the time dating and getting very close to a woman by the name of Linda Eastman. Linda's father and brother were attorneys in New York City. They too managed high-profile members of New York society, members of the arts community, if you will. And so at the same time that John was announcing to EMI management that he was turning everything over to Alan Klein, Paul was pushing for a relationship contractually with the firm of Eastman and Eastman. Well, as you can imagine, this caused a great deal of discord and contention among the four members of the band. This ultimately culminated in Paul filing a lawsuit against the other three Beatles and Apple Corporation on December 31st of 1970 to formally sever that relationship. A very, very sad day for we Beatles fans. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of factors that led to their breakup is simply the idea that they all had their own individual interests at this point in their lives that they wanted to pursue. They did not want to be members of the Beatles for the rest of their lives. For example, George was getting very much into Indian music. He was also interested in exploring his own spirituality, for lack of a better term. John and Yoko formed the Plastic Ono Band before the Beatles had even formally broken up. Ringo at this point was well underway with recording and production of his first solo album, Sentimental Journey. And Paul was interested in other things such as scoring film projects. He also released the solo album in April 1970, only 4 months after filing that lawsuit. So clearly he was working on that before the Beatles broke up. So the fact is, although the entrance of Yoko Ono into John's life was certainly a factor in the breakup of the Beatles, it was not the only factor. The next thing I want to talk about then is the phenomenon that we have come to call Beatlemania, that hysterical, completely uncontrolled behavior of Beatles fans. The point I want to make, though, is that there was a specific date when Beatlemania was born. It did not grow slowly as their fame grew. It is not something that somebody came up with as we look back in time at the behavior of Beatles fans at their shows. There was a specific time that the phenomenon, if you will, began. But before we get into those possible dates, I want to talk about the origin of the word Beatlemania. There are a couple possibilities here. First of all, there was a music promoter named Andy Lothian, if I have his name right. While speaking to a reporter on one of the Beatles tours through Scotland in 1963, he claims to have used that term. The term Beatlemania also shows up in October of 1963 in an edition of the Daily Mail, which is a British newspaper. So who knows exactly who really came up with the term. But as far as possible dates for the birth of Beatlemania, the first date we want to look at is April 18th, 1963. That's the day that the Beatles performed at the Royal Albert Hall. And Chris Hutchins, who was a music editor at the time for Disc Magazine, observed this hysterical behavior and attaches that date with the birth of Beatlemania. The second possible date is October 13th of 1963. This is the date that the Beatles performed at the Palladium at the Sunday Night at the Palladium TV show. And again, this was a time when this out-of-control hysterical behavior was observed. Something else that is unique about that performance was that it had an estimated audience of 15 million. So it was more than hundreds, it was more than thousands, and so a lot of people looked to that date as the date that Beatlemania was born. But there's a third date, and interestingly enough, this is the date that the Beatles themselves believe Beatlemania was born. That date is October 31st, 1963. By way of some background, following their show at the Palladium, the Beatles went on tour through Europe, and that included a stop in Sweden. When they returned to London from their tour stop in Sweden, they were met by thousands of fans at the airport. This would have been the first time, following the very successful Palladium performance, that they returned to London from somewhere else, if all that makes sense. And the reception that they received was termed Beatlemania. And that is the date, as I said, that the Beatles themselves believe that Beatlemania actually began. But regardless of the date, it really didn't let up until 1967, when the Beatles stopped touring and focused on recording in the studio. But for those 3 years, Beatlemania was a very real thing, and not just in Britain, not just in the US, but worldwide. For example, let's look at the single She Loves You. That single was released on August 23rd, 1963. Pre-sales began in June, 2 months prior, and 500,000 pre-sales of that record were made. And of course, it shot to #1 immediately upon its release. Additionally, just look at the reception that the Beatles got when they landed at JFK Airport when they came over to the US for their performance on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964. It should be noted that the Beatles were completely shocked by the reception that they got at the airport. In fact, the story is told of how, as they were approaching the airport, the pilot came over the loudspeaker on the airplane and said, quote, "A large crowd has gathered at the airport." And then once they landed and they were in the limo driving from the airport to the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, they were listening on the radio as the radio DJ actually provided a running commentary on their progress from the airport to their hotel. But perhaps the most striking evidence of Beatlemania is something that occurred on April 4th, 1964. On that date, the top 5 spots of the Billboard Top 100 Rock and Roll Songs were occupied by Beatles songs. Those 5 songs were Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me. Look at the film A Hard Day's Night. It was originally going to be titled Beatlemania, but then Ringo came up with one of his Ringoisms, and the title was changed to A Hard Day's Night. As a side note, Beatlemania was particularly evident during their live shows, the way the fans would react as they listened to them play. I say listen to them play. The fact is that they could very seldom hear what the Beatles were playing. And this quickly became to be a real problem for the 4 members of the band, as you can imagine, when they figured out that the fans weren't necessarily screaming out of appreciation for their music because they really couldn't hear the music. They were just screaming uncontrollably out of the hysteria of the moment, if you will, and excited to one day be able to tell their grandkids, I was there. Well, although the intensity of Beatlemania may have died down to some degree, there's evidence that it still exists today, 50 years later, as you look at the continued popularity of the Beatles. For example, the numerous Beatles tribute bands. I happen to be a big fan of 1964, the tribute. They come here to beautiful Red Rocks Amphitheater every fall. I have my tickets for this coming August. I've gone every year for the past several years, and it never ceases to amaze me. It sells out every year, and it's not just the size of the audience, but the age of the audience. Yes, there are a lot of people my age and older, but there are also a lot of teenagers and even young children. So the fame and popularity and wonder that is the Beatles is certainly being passed on now to future generations. You look at all the movies that have been made about the Beatles, and I don't mean Hard Day's Night and Help and Yellow Submarine. I mean movies such as Across the Universe, which is a great film released in 2007. The Ron Howard movie, 8 Days a Week, The Touring Years, that's a great film released in 2016. The movie Yesterday came out in 2019, very entertaining film. And of course, as Beatles fans, we're all anxiously anticipating the release of Peter Jackson's film Get Back, which will cover the Let It Be recording sessions. As you know, it was delayed because of COVID, but a tentative release date of August 27th of this year is now scheduled. If you haven't, I would encourage you to save up your pennies and go to Las Vegas and see the show Love, the Cirque du Soleil collaboration with George Harrison and Giles Martin, George Martin's son. A wonderful, very entertaining show for Beatles fans. You look at all the podcasts out there about the Beatles, like mine, or this YouTube channel that, like the one you're watching right now. There's a Sirius XM radio station devoted to the Beatles. They are the most covered band of all time in terms of songs that have been covered. The song Yesterday has been covered by more bands than any other song in history. And then, of course, there are the countless books that people have written about the Beatles. If you look over my left shoulder, you'll see a whole bookshelf filled with books on the Beatles. I've read all of them, and I know that that is not nearly all the books that have been written. So the fact is, there was a specific date when Beatlemania was born. And although it may not be as significant and as intense as it was from 1964 to 1967, it does continue today. And based on what I've seen, there's no end in sight. The final thing I want to talk about in this first episode, entitled Interesting Facts You May or May Not Have Known About the Beatles, is the fact that at one point, the Beatles were actually known as a German band. Here is the backstory. As I mentioned previously, the Beatles really cut their teeth, if you will. They learned how to become a top-flight rock and roll band with a specific sound during several trips they made to Hamburg, Germany to play in various clubs in an area known as the Reeperbahn, which is a pretty seedy part of town. They ended up making 5 such trips to Hamburg, the first of which took place from August 18th to October 16th of 1960. They were hired, as you may recall, by a man by the name of Bruno Koschmider to come and play in his Indoor Club. Well, over time, their popularity grew, and Mr. Koschmider then moved them to his much larger Kaiserkiller Club. Well, their popularity spread, and as other club owners heard about this up-and-coming group, the Beatles, they began wanting them for their clubs. And so at one point, although they were still under contract with Bruno Koschmider, they accepted a gig at the much larger and competing Top 10 Club. Needless to say, Bruno Koschmider was quite upset by this, and he fired them. But he did more than just fire them. For example, he found out that George Harrison, as a 17-year-old, was not of legal age to be playing in these clubs, and so he immediately had George deported back to England. He had Paul and Pete Best arrested as arsonists when they lit a condom on fire in the living accommodations that Bruno had provided for them. At this point, John had nobody to play with, and so he returned to Liverpool as well. You may recall from the previous episode that Stuart Sutcliffe remained in Hamburg to pursue his relationship with Astrid Kircher. Well, after a few days back in Liverpool and having recovered from the madness that was being a rock and roll star in Hamburg, they began taking gigs again around Liverpool. The first of these was back at the Casbah. You may remember this as the small coffee club in the basement of Mona Best's home. We have to remember that the kids that made up the audience at the Casbah had not seen this band, at least with any regularity, for about 1.5 years, and they didn't know quite what to expect. And it wasn't till after quite a while of hearing them playing that they realized that this was what used to be known as the Quarrymen. Well, Neil Aspinall, which is a name you may recognize, he was currently a boarder in the Mona Best home, and in order to generate more excitement about this new band, he announced them as having come straight from Germany. Then on December 27th, the Beatles accepted a gig at Litherland Town Hall. Not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Might be Litherland, I guess. Well, as the time approached for the Beatles to go on stage, a well-known rock and roll DJ, Bob Wooler, took the mic in hand and with great excitement said, "Direct from Hamburg, the band you've been waiting for, the Beatles." So the fact is, at least for a short period of time, the Beatles were known as a band from Germany. That concludes episode 1. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about some of these stories that you may or may not have known about the Beatles. I would invite you to also check out my podcast, also entitled Beatle Basics, where I share quite a bit more information on these same topics and these same stories. You can find that on pretty much any podcast platform. I also invite you to check out my next episode, which will be on Beatles producer George Martin. We'll see you soon.